Okay, this is the second lecture on the Crusades. I talked about the uh, Muslim expansion and then the First Crusade, and just basically talked about urban marshaling together of force. So, I think that I would like to just spend a little bit of time talking about two things before moving into the Second Crusade. The first thing that I would like to talk about is the kind of motivations behind a crusade. How did this get going? Why was it successful? Why was Urban successful in marshaling a Western army to go east to Byzantium and win? How was it packaged or described, and what was it about that description that was successful? And the second thing is, I think that it's important to talk about the methods that the Seljuk Turks and the Arabic caliphates in North Africa, what was the subjugation practice? What were the things that were going on that created kind of a hostile dissatisfaction with the conquest? I need to say something here about dissatisfaction with the occupying force. There were some people who when the conquest began, who thought that the Arabic armies were actually a liberating force. They were happy that they were there, and in particular, Jews and Monophysite Christians, because in Byzantium, after the time of Justinian, to be a Monophysite was a heresy. And so there were always these attempts to coerce Monophysite Syrian Christians into a Chalcedonian framework confession. So when Asia Minor is taken over, the Monophysite Christians think that this is a blessing to them. And they were allowed to maintain their Christian identity. Of course, they had to pay the tribute tax in order to do that. Here's the interesting thing about the politics of it. Who are the Muslim? Who are they going to use as tax collectors? Who are they going to get the money? Are they going around with soldiers and swords? And the answer is no. They're using the churches as tax collectors. You take up an offering from your people, and we will let your church and your religion continue. But if you don't, and I don't know what's going to happen. So you had this kind of interesting growth of ecclesiastical power underneath the caliphates. Because they gained prestige within the dhimmi framework of the Arabic conquest. So some people thought that it was a liberating thing, that the Byzantines or the Chalcedonians were just getting their butts kicked all the time. However, there's also dissatisfaction that arises even from within the dhimmi servitude, because you have to maintain the subjugation. And the ways in which the subjugation was maintained was, first, degradation. And this has to do with, certainly public humiliation, but also beatings. Somebody could be walking down the street. I mean, there's one story where a group of Muslim Arabic soldiers basically executed a local's camel because the camel peed on the road that Muslims were walking on. So that's what I mean by degradation. They're certainly making fun of, public humiliation, but then there's these kinds of shenanigans, these ways of acting, and there's nothing that the dhimmi could do about it. It was just, you just have to take this one on the chin. The second form of subjugation is the confiscation of property. So what you would have is they would come in, they would distribute the property, the houses, because behind the army, because these are fundamentally nomadic tribes coming up from the Arabian Peninsula, and they're bringing all their people with them. They're bringing the women and the children, and the army comes in, runs people out, or kills them, or sells them into slavery, and then you just occupy the houses that have been vacated. 3, taxation. Already talked about the tribute tax. 4, kidnapping and rape. There are stories of people being kidnapped and then ransomed in order to gain money. This is all a profit deal that's going on here. And rape is also a means of subjugation. Wives and daughters are raped in front of brothers and husbands. And this occurs frequently, especially in villages out in the countryside. 5, in some caliphates, Christians and Jews are forced to wear distinct clothing so that they can be identified on the streets. And 6, forced conversions. Now, Muhammad taught against forced conversions, but forced conversions, while prohibited by Muhammad, was not prohibited in practice. It occurs often, many times through torture, sometimes through coercion or threats. But this was a constant issue. There is one thing, though, just in terms of practically speaking. Once somebody does in fact convert, then they are no longer part of this non-Muslim working class. And so there was an ebb and flow, like an increase and a reduction of forced conversions, because if the conversion level gets too high, then there's nobody to pay the tax, which gets money for the caliphate. So, in different times and in different areas, depending upon the whim of the caliph, would determine whether or not there is a push for conversion or an increase in taxes. Now, moving on to the second thing, how is it that the urban was able to get such traction in the West? Okay, first off, Pope Urban does not call for a crusade. That term comes later. What he calls for is people to take the sign of the cross, crux signati. That's Latin, crux signati, the sign of the cross, cruxus signati, the sign of the cross. that gets called crusade. Cruxus, crusade, signati. So whenever you took your vow that you were going to be a part of this Western army, you sealed that vow with the sign of the cross. That's where we get the term crusade, though Urban doesn't call for it. Now, how does it get traction? First, taking the sign of the cross was seen as an extreme form of pilgrimage and penance. Penance had been a part of Christian piety all the way in Carthage in the middle of the 3rd century, in the 250s. Cyprian, if you'll remember, Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, basically had what amounts to a penitential discipline, by which I mean assigning alms, or alms is basically offerings to the poor, assigning alms or pilgrimage to those people who are in sin. Pilgrimages are important, they're part of piety, and the crusade is seen as an extreme or an advanced form of penitential pilgrimage. 2, there is a soldier of Christ motif that is a part of popular Christian imagination. The soldier of Christ dates all the way back to the 300s, when the monks were considered soldiers of Christ. They were considered soldiers of Christ because they went into the deserts and they prayed and fasted against the devil. So you have monks starting here in the 300s after Constantine legalizes Christianity, and they're called soldiers of Christ because they're about doing spiritual warfare. So you already have the soldier of Christ mentality with respect to monks, which goes back to with monks, and now you actually put it into a martial scenario, an actual fighting scenario. 3, there is an imitation of Christ motif, imitatio Christi, to imitate Christ. You imitate Christ by putting your life on the line for somebody else. So what does Jesus say? Greater love has no one than this, that they lay their life down for a friend. And I, Jesus, call you friends, and I will lay my life down for you. That's in the Gospel of John. So you have this imitating Christ who lays his life down for somebody else. And this is already part of piety. It's already part of Christian self-understanding. You should sacrifice yourself for your brother. As a matter of fact, Augustine had argued in the 400s that a Christian cannot defend him or herself, but it is required of a Christian to come to the aid and help of another Christian. So, while I can't defend myself, I can defend you. So, this is basically what Urban is calling for. He's calling for people to imitate Christ, to put their lives on the line, to defend their Christian brothers and sisters. A 4th way in which Urban's call for a crusade was able to get traction was because of the eschatological fervor that surrounded the Muslim conquest. So, first, 90 years, sure, it's a long time from the millennium, from the turn to 1,000, but there really was fear about the turn to the millennium, that the end of the world was nigh. Of course, you didn't get the end of the world in 1000, But what you did get in 1009 was the destruction of one of the most sacred Christian pilgrimage sites, the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That seems like, my God, the end of the world is coming. Some of our great cities and sites are being destroyed. So, we've got to hasten we have to, not hasten, I'm sorry, we have to, in terms of the eschatological mentality, we have to do warfare against the demonic incursions that are manifested in the Arabic armies. That's the mentality that is out there in the populace, and also within the preaching. This is the end of the world. And then the fifth reason why the crusade was able to get such traction is simply this, is the promise for fame. Now, I should say this, that contrary to popular belief, no one who went on a crusade ended up richer having gone on the crusade. In terms of the individual soldier. The individual soldier didn't make a ton of money. It wasn't loot, 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 and then put the money in your pockets and go back home. Because where are you gonna carry it? Where are you gonna hold it? I mean, you're in the middle of fighting. You're gonna have a trunk full of stuff. Now, certainly looting does go on, but when you're talking about individual soldiers, that is how they pay for their sustenance. It's not to get rich. All right. So those are the first two opening things to be said, and now I want to move into the Second Crusade. What is going on that opens up the doors to the Second Crusade? Okay, there are a couple of precursors. Precursor is something that occurs that helps trigger something afterward. So, a couple of precursors. The first, I already mentioned the Western bases that were established after the First Crusade. Now, in the previous video, I said that Damascus was one of the four, and I was wrong about that. It's actually Edessa. Damascus is a very important city. It, however, is not one of the four Western bases. Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, Jerusalem. Okay. Everything is going well. I mean, there really isn't any turmoil from 1099 to 1119. So there's basically a 2-decade peace in the area. The Muslim armies are consolidating. There's some infighting going on amongst the caliphates. There is some movement and maneuvering, but it's not an aggressive onslaught against those holdings. Until 1127, when Antioch lost its entire army. Now, the city of Antioch was not lost, but in 1127 there is a move against Antioch, decimating the entire army. The city was fortified so that they couldn't actually get into the city. They tried to lay siege to it, but they just didn't have the mechanisms that it would take to take the city. So, you basically have the loss of the Western base's army. Then, the third precursor to the Second Crusade was the development of military orders. Okay, by order, I mean things like monastic orders. It's like groups of monks. So, in English, we say a monastic order, and an order is an official group. there begins in the, after the First Crusade, the establishment of military orders. They're basically martial monks. Later on, this kind of becomes knighthood and the code of chivalry, if you've ever heard of these things before. All right, the first and basically most influential military order were the Templars. They began as protectors of pilgrims. They were basically the security force. They were established by Hugh of Paynes. They were established in 1127. A monk named Bernard of Clairvaux was a big fan of the Templars and a big fan of military orders. As a matter of fact, he's such a fan of military orders that he wrote an entire pamphlet or a treatise praising monk knights. Bernard did. Talk about Bernard and later on in the semester. It's enough to say here at this particular point that Bernard was a recruiter for the Second Crusade and a recruiter for the Third Crusade. The second military order that's established are the Hospitallars. The Hospitallars. They were recognized as an order in 1113 by the Pope. They started as the security force where there were sick people. That's how they started. Hospitals, Hospitallars. They were basically the police force to keep those who had become injured from being taken advantage of. So you have these military orders, which means you basically have a source of professional soldiers. Okay, and the fourth precursor to the Second Crusade is the rise of the warlord Zangi. Who was a Seljuk Turk. In 1144, Zangi moved this way into Edessa. 1144 moved into Edessa, destroyed the army that was there, and every single Latin Christian in the city was put to death. Every single one. Zangi allowed for Byzantine Christians to remain to pay their tribute tax. But any Latin Christian man was killed by the sword. Women were sold into slavery. Okay. When Edessa is taken by Zangi, the Pope at the time, whose name was Eugenius, calls for the Second Crusade, which occurs between 1146 and 1148. It was specifically called for, the Pope targeted the French and the Italians to supply the majority of the soldiers. To call this crusade, Pope Eugenius sent out a papal encyclical. Papal encyclical means a circulating letter that comes from the Pope's own hand. In this papal encyclical, Pope Eugenius talks about the First Crusade, Urban calling that First Crusade, and the success of it. Eugenius talks very favorably about what Pope Urban II had done. He, Eugenius, does something that Urban didn't do, however, and that is, for anybody who participates in the Second Crusade, they will be absolved from all of their sins. No penance. Ever. Now, that doesn't mean that you've got a free ticket to heaven. You could still end up committing apostasy. But what it does mean is Pope Eugenius says, if you take the sign of the cross and you go on this crusade, the church will never ask you to pay penance, to do penance, or pay alms or anything like that again. All right. The problem was there was no stated goal in this encyclical. The idea was we just need to recapture Edessa and defeat Zangi. In 1147, the French armies led by Louis VII and a German army led by Conrad III set out together eastward toward Edessa. These two kings responded to Eugenius's encyclical, and that started the tradition of nobles and kings agreeing to the call to crusade, and then the army then comes from the nation whose king or nobles heeded the call. The First Crusade is not like that. The Second Crusade, however, is. They head eastward toward Byzantium, but the Comnenian emperor, Alexis's grandson, Manuel, did not like the look of these two large armies that are moving toward his realm. Conrad, his army arrived before Louis VII's army, and he left Nicaea and went eastward to fight the Seljuks, and he got creamed. That's English for he got beat really, really bad. He was actually wounded and had to flee back to Nicaea, and many of his army deserted and ran back to Germany. Those who did not flee, he regrouped with Louis VII, and they had a joint army that went out to Mount Cadmus. Went up to Mount Cadmus in January of 1148, and that coalition army was destroyed. And the Second Crusade is over. It is an abject failure. Two Western armies are completely destroyed. Their kings go back to their places in humiliation, and Zangi and the Seljuk Turks strengthen their hold in Syria. All right.